Welcome to the Village Well podcast, brought to you by Village Well Books and Coffee in downtown Culver City. Welcome back to the Village Well podcast. I'm Jennifer Casper, your host, and I'm happy to be joined this morning for our intro by Josh Stretton Carlson, our podcast producer. How you doing, Josh?
Good. How are you, Jen?
I'm pretty good. A little tired.
Yeah, a lot going on.
As usual. Yeah, things are actually slowed down a little bit. We had, a week ago, we had a huge protest in Culver City on Saturday, and it was just pandemonium in the store that day. It wasn't in the store, but it was at City Hall, which is across the street from us. So that was the biggest gathering we've ever had right out in front of the store. And it was pretty remarkable. And it just felt like I was spinning. There was just so much going on.
It was, it's good to remember that there are people out there in the world who are on your side, you know?
I know.
It's good to see people.
Have solidarity, to feel energized.
But it definitely was chaotic in the shop.
Yeah. So we're coming up to the end of Pride Month, which is always so great. We have so many great books about Pride. And to close things out this month, we're going to be at Culver City's Pride Ride and Rally on Saturday. They do a bike ride starting at 4 p.m, and then they get over to the town plaza where they're going to have a party. And we'll be there with our van selling books, and we're going to have a drag queen there doing story time. The drag queen's name is Pickle, and she heads up Drag Story Hour for Los Angeles. It's
going to be a good one. Shout out to one of the organizers, Phoebe, for helping putting all of this together.
Jack Galanti, who has for years done a lot of our decorations here. He's one of the organizers.
There we go.
Yeah.
Tons of books for Pride if folks want to check them out.
Yeah. And it's Pride in Culver City all year round, but it's really fun to have that display where we can focus all these books because they're all so beautiful and colorful. Pride really fits with the Village Well vibe and brand.
Absolutely.
The colorful, inclusive nature of it.
And a little teaser, we're going to actually have a drag queen on the podcast very shortly. Just recorded that, and that's going to be coming up soon.
Yeah. So, Little Miss Hot Mess.
Yes.
So I'm really happy to be sharing with our audience the interview today with Mo Ogrodnik, who wrote the book Gulf. It was a really eye-opening book for me, and it was really fun to record the interview with Brett, one of our booksellers and event planners. That was a really fun one.
Absolutely. Please enjoy.
Welcome to the Village Well podcast. I'm Jennifer Casper, your host, and I'm here with my co-host, Brett Morrow, who is a bookseller and an event planner here at Village Well.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, Brett. We are pleased to be joined today by Mo Ogrodnik. Hey, Mo.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's so great to be here.
We're so excited to talk to you. Mo is a filmmaker, writer, and professor in the film department at NYU. She was the Associate Dean of Arts for NYU in Abu Dhabi and the director of Find, a creative lab exploring the transnational heritage of the UAE. She served as a mentor for the Sundance Labs in Jordan and received fellowships from Yaddo and McDowell.
She was also my professor in my freshman year of film school back in 2019.
And you were an excellent student.
Thank you. It was called Art and Practice. It was a big kind of lecture class. So I think this is like one of our first ever actual conversations, which is kind of funny. But it was interesting. Jen was just like, do you know a Mo Ogrodnik? And I was like, I had like flashbacks. And
a huge lecture class of 180 students.
Yeah, it was a big one.
The connections got our attention, and then the subject of the book really made us want to dig deeper. Mo's book, Gulf, is a work of fiction that digs into contemporary social and economic issues in the Middle East, mostly in Gulf state countries, with lots of wealth and new development. And it's a side of the conversation that we don't hear about every day. And we're going to try to make this conversation mostly spoiler-free. So let's try to remind ourselves to do that.
Thank you.
We always open our conversations asking our guests to write a shelf talker for their book. So, you know, the little index card-sized recommendation cards that we put throughout the store to recommend books. If you have to describe Gulf in just a couple sentences, how would you do that?
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's such a pleasure to be here. And what a remarkable bookstore. I'm so inspired.
Well,
thank you.
Thrilled to have you.
So I guess I would say Gulf is about 5 diverse women in the Arabian Gulf who are all facing their ethical limitations and desire for freedom. and that it is a story about the Gulf as a place, but also the Gulf within ourselves and the Gulf between people.
That's a good pitch, Mo. You said you were
Thanks.
struggling to figure out how to
It's
do
a
that.
hard one. It's hard when you have to pitch 5 different characters, but
Yeah.
I'm trying to think about what these are the larger issues that the book is thinking about.
Did you find that, like when it came to marketing the book, that they had trouble trying, like figuring out how to do that? Because I think that there's kind of a spoiler on like the inside flap, and I kind of regret that I had read that. What was that?
That is so interesting.
Like-
I feel like it's interesting when you, because this is my first book coming out of film, it was really my incredible agent, Anna Stein, who, that was the first time that you have to kind of pitch the book is before it's sold, when it's going out to different editors. And she did such a beautiful job. And we also looked at other benchmark, examples of polyphonic novels like Let the Great World Spin or some of Sanjeev Sahot's work, or just kind of people who have been exploring stories that are told from multiple points of view and how they do that. And so I think that was really helpful. And then the publisher, the UK publisher and the US publisher, we really worked a lot on the copy that will go on the back. And so some of that copy was taken from that first letter that Anna Stein wrote when we went out with the book. So, yeah.
Yeah. So how did the book come about? How did you decide to write about this part of the world? We know that you taught at NYU's program in Abu Dhabi, so that was probably where you got the idea. But what was it like being there?
Yeah, so I worked on the NYU Abu Dhabi project for 5 years. It was a really remarkable project. The vision of the project was to create an international honors college that would be deeply international and diverse in terms of where students came from, and that it would be a deeply interdisciplinary college in terms of how it kind of thinks about learning and topics, and that the science center would be next to the arts center. And at the same time, I had this, which you talk about, I had a creative lab called FIND, which the point of that lab was to, FIND stands for Forming Intersections and Dialogues. So a lot of kind of heritage in the UAE is Emirati heritage, which is about, Emiratis at that time were about 10% of the population. 90% of the population are not citizens. You know, they are people coming, whether they're South Asian, North, you know, they're from all different parts of the world, who have been doing a lot of nation building on all different levels. And I was very interested in what would it look like to start capturing those stories of building a country to create a narrative that was more inclusive through the lens of artists and scholars and technologists. So I think that was something that really got me interested. And then I had a very close friend, Yasmin Hassan, who ran this global women's organization called Equality Now. And she called me because there were 5 South Asian women who had collectively murdered their trafficker, who needed legal representation. And she said, can you help me? And through that process of helping to get a lawyer, that's when I started to really start to research and to see all of these different incidents of female on female violence in the region. In that case, a lot of them were, you know, women and their traffickers, or it could be between domestic workers and their employers. But I was also thinking about the female morality police. And then I was really starting to think about the inheritance of American violence in the region and how I was a part of that, and how erasure was a big part of that, especially in terms of thinking about the Iraq war that was happening at that time and all the drone strikes that were happening. And so I felt there was thematically something that was really interesting that I wanted to begin to unravel. And then I got research grants to go to the Philippines, where I spent time with 40 women in a domestic worker training center who were being deployed to Saudi. And then I went to Ethiopia and I worked with the ILL, the International Labor Organization, to help connect me with Gulf return girls. So those are girls who had been illegally trafficked up through Yemen into the Gulf and returned. So it was just like, I kind of just became really obsessed.
And all the while you're working on building this NYU program?
Yes. So I was building that program in the arts. That was my job, was to really build the arts programs and think about the Performing Arts Center. And I had this research project that was really getting me out into the landscape, really thinking about this transnational element. And I was just completely fascinated by the global aspect of the landscape. And it was just not something that I had really encountered in the same way ever before. So, yeah.
Those relationships that you had with like those 5 women who murdered their trafficker and the women that you spent time with in the Philippines, did any of their stories kind of get into golf or like inform the characters that you're writing about?
So there's no one that I interviewed that then their story is in the book. No. But I would say that, for instance, when I went to Ethiopia and I met with those girls, that I went to the Falasha village, and there was this whole place that had all these blue stones and blue stars. And then that really informed a kind of more of a poetic image system for Escudero. And I would say that a lot of the research, not only in terms of talking to people, but the visual research and how important that is in narrative storytelling, right? To have an image system or to have something that is being explored and repeated that starts to accrue a kind of meaning. That was really helpful to be doing that kind of research. Or this idea of like flora and a lot of the training center scenes. I could have never written those scenes if I hadn't actually spent time in a domestic worker training center.
Right. And speaking of those images that you talk about, like on the back flap and all that, it says that it's like a very cinematic novel. Considering your background as a filmmaker, did it ever start as a script, like something that you wanted to shoot, or from the beginning did you kind of see it as this, novel?
So it's interesting. I really wanted to write a novel. I felt that it would be almost impossible to get this made if, for instance, I had written it as a series first. I just felt, just in terms of, unfortunately, just the racism, it's women, like how are we going to do that? Especially when I started writing it, there wasn't this sense of kind of global storytelling in the way that's really starting to emerge, across different languages right now, which I think is so exciting. But I would say that all of that, my background as a documentary filmmaker and then as a narrative filmmaker, it's very evident, I think, in the book.
But you envisioned this as a book instead of a documentary.
Yes. It's so interesting. So many people ask me that question. And I went back to get a degree in fiction from the NYU Low Residency program in Paris, where I worked with incredible mentors. And I think through those 2 years of that program, I was just exposed to so many different writers, so many different ways of thinking about story and thinking about structure, that I just felt so free in a way that I hadn't before, and that it has completely changed how I teach screenwriting now. I am a completely different kind of teacher in terms of those workshops, of how I bring in poetry and the image and prose and short stories, as well as obviously the screenplay form. But I think there's something very generative for a young storyteller to really feel that the access to all these narrative forms can help them.
And is this something that you would want to see adapted?
Yes. I think the stories of these 5 women are so important, and that there's something about, instead of focusing so much on the differences, but beginning to think about how these 5 women are connected in terms of being part of larger political systems around labor, migration, how nation states, right? All those kinds of things, and how that plays out in our lives in these domestic, very personal and intimate ways. I feel that that's, remarkable. And I think the idea of having a series that would be in these different languages, I feel like I want to watch that show.
Yeah. Yeah. And so a lot of like the character storylines do overlap, but there are some characters who are kind of off on their own. And I was just wondering, what do you think is like the thread through all of these characters? I guess you just touched on it a little bit, but you want to expand on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I guess because I was in kind of revolt against a certain kind of way of thinking about story in terms of plot A, I knew that I wanted to have this polyphonic story, but that it wasn't going to be, and then they all meet, right? That I just felt like that was so cheap, and I just didn't want to do that. And so I began to really think about exactly what you're saying, like, well, what is the central through line here that's connecting these women? So one of the central through lines that every story interrogates is female on female violence, and how violence is defined is very different in each story. So that can be violence to the self. That can be, the violence of erasure. That can be physical violence. Right? There's so many different forms of violence. So I was very interested in that. And then I was really interested also in the inheritance, that young women and girls receive from their mothers. And so that is another whole theme of kind of how, mothers, in their own attempt to have a kind of agency and freedom, in some ways often stifle that in their own children. So we know, for instance, in terms of FGM, one of the largest kind of proponents of FGM are actually women in those communities.
Can you define FGM for us?
So that's female genital mutilation.
Gotcha. And so I guess we see that a little bit through the character of Zaina, who she's kind of pushing forward this system, and it's not clear how much she agrees with it and how much it's just her trying to survive and get by.
But you do see her embrace it to some extent. Mm-hmm. She doesn't completely turn away from it. She finds some kind of connection and meaning through her engagement with the, what is it called? The
Hansa Brigade. Yeah. So I guess I had a rule for myself that I am not allowed to turn away or against any of my characters. Mm-hmm. That was kind of a rule, that my job was to try to understand psychologically, emotionally, how does a woman navigate and kind of these kinds of spaces and situations. So with the situation with Zaina in Syria, I did a lot of research of, State Department reports, going on ISIS sites, like really just going on, different kinds of social media, trying to understand what was bringing these women from different parts of the world to Raqqa, what they felt in terms of how that fit into their feminist ideology, what they were trying to escape or leave, what they were hoping to find, and what if I found myself in that situation, what would get me to say, yes, I'm going to be part of this kind of community? Like what would that take for me? Yeah. And it's very interesting with the Kurds, because I think with the YPJ and the YPG, that group is a deeply feminist kind of radical political group. And I was very interested in that. So again, these were all kinds of questions. I was just kind of so deeply curious about these larger questions. And in some ways, writing the book was a way for me to explore some of those questions.
So I'm imagining when you lived in the Arabian Gulf, in Abu Dhabi,
yep,
that you encountered characters like these. You observed them or you met them. But was there a Zaina type character that you met? Or did you just see these images on the TV and it felt very close to home? Or
so one of the people who worked on Find was Syrian. And I think it was his reaction to what the United States was not doing that awakened me to a certain kind of consciousness. Yeah. And I think that there was something about living there that for the first time, I came in contact with the repercussions of American choices that I felt culpable for, in a way that I didn't just living here or even in traveling in Western Europe. And I think trying to answer and think about that, and again, to kind of brutal honesty, like, how am I culpable? What does that mean? What would it mean for a character who feels very conflicted about trying to be accountable, but who has a younger child who is kind of holding her feet to the fire, which I have two younger, really wonderful political children. So that is definitely autobiographical firsthand.
And they were with you over there.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about that sense of culpability and just how you feel like you fit into this all?
Yeah. So, another great question. So I just wrote this piece for the Paris Review called The Ghost of Ream Island, which is very much about this. It is really looking at the global university, which at the time really felt like this incredible opportunity. And there was a lot of kind of talking about globalization and cosmopolitanism and just the dream of what that could be, right? And at the same time, while we were there, we were building this university, there was the UAE 94 trial where there were lawyers and academics who were being imprisoned for, basically issues that we would consider free speech. There's the war in Yemen, right? There's the labor infractions that are happening at the Guggenheim and the Louvre.
The museums that are being built over there.
That were being built over there. There were questions of academic freedom, right? A lot of people in New York, the faculty in New York, were saying, well, what is this going to mean if we have this global campus, but we don't really have academic freedom, not only in Abu Dhabi, but now we're building another campus in Shanghai. So I think that kind of exactly, okay, I am definitely culpable in helping to build something that seems complicated. It seems ethically complicated. And so I guess in terms of the whole project, and I think even living over there, it's kind of saying, okay, what does that mean to say I am choosing to be in a place that is morally ambiguous or is complex? That, even in terms of the laws of the land, right? You can't criticize the government. You can't criticize Islam. There's no kind of physical forms of affection publicly. Okay, that's the agreement that we have if you're going to come here and do this. So what does that mean if you agree to do that, right? I think the thing that's really interesting is how, when I wrote this book, the landscape in the U.S. has changed drastically. Issues in the book now are issues that we're facing here in this country. And, Saudi Arabia is head of the UN Commission of Women right now, right? So I think maybe people don't really realize that, but I think just kind of really thinking about, and Dunya even says this at one point, right? That the West is constantly criticizing labor, but of course, all of the U.S. was based on slavery and genocide. So, just what does it mean to really just say, okay, I'm just going to embrace that. It is ugly. It is complicated. I'm just going to try to just navigate that and not try to feel like I have to live in a binary place with it.
This is a question from producer Josh. In your research, what was the most interesting thing that you came across or the most unexpected?
Well, I guess I would say the most moving and maybe unexpected or meaningful has been really this deep sense of genuine connection I feel with these women and their experiences, even though they are so vastly different from my own. And that psychological, emotional, creative exercise of kind of like really trying to imagine and research what these lives are like, I feel that I am a changed person.
I have a bit of a craft question. I think it's pretty apparent from reading, like when you first start reading the book, that the chapters are incredibly short. It feels very like kaleidoscopic. And I was wondering if that structure was something that you landed on very early on, or is it just something that kind of arose naturally? And also, what were you trying to accomplish with that?
So I guess I feel that, and maybe this is my film background, but I think in a lot of ways, once I started kind of coming around to these, okay, I think it's going to be these 5 characters. Flora was the first person that I started writing. The typhoon scene, I think, was the first scene I wrote. I think that I'm such a visual person, so I think I would just see a scene and then I would just start writing those scenes, and it wasn't in order. It was just like, okay, I'm thinking about, this character here, or I'm doing this research. A lot of times the research will, because it's visual research online or whatever, that will, create a whole scene or a series of scenes. Or, thinking about the Falcon or thinking about dioramas or whatever it would be, right? So I would just kind of, at first, it was like, okay, I'm imagining all these scenes. I'm just going to write them down. And then I started to kind of think about this quintet structure. And actually, for a really long time, Eskedar, the Ethiopian girl, she existed in the middle of the book in one complete story. And I was really resistant to this idea of like, oh, it should just be these repeating 5 voices. I knew that that was an option, but I was really resistant for some reason. She's also told in the present tense. And there are reasons that when people read the book to understand, I wanted to kind of animate her in the middle, that there she's completely alive, right, and present. And that's why she's told in the present tense. But that then became this quintet structure towards the end. And when I also realized, well, I can just mix her in present tense.
Yeah, this is kind of tangential, but I recently watched the movie The Nickel Boys. For some reason, the feeling I felt while watching that movie was incredibly similar to how I felt reading Golf, where it felt like I was like reliving memories or something. And I think part of that is just like how first person it feels, and even though it's written in third person, but it really feels like you're getting into the headspace of these characters. And then in Nickel Boys, of course, I'm not sure if you've seen it.
Of course, it's a beautiful
it's
film.
A beautiful movie.
I love that film.
Yeah,
so
it's a great movie. And I don't know if you've seen it, Jen, but the camera is like the character's eyes. So it's like first person.
It's beautifully subjective,
Yeah,
right? But it also has this documentary feel to it. I mean, his background, he's also a documentary filmmaker.
Right. And I don't know, I was just struck by how empathetic the prose felt, especially with Eskedar. I remember reading the scene where I think it's the scene she's born or something. And I just remember feeling like you had so much love for these characters. And I was just, I don't know, you said that something that struck you is how moved you were by hearing these stories, even though these women were so vastly different from you. And I was just wondering, did it ever just, how did you access that empathy?
You know, I think being a film director and working with actors, that again, it's kind of the same thing. And even when I'm teaching directing the actor, as a director, you can never not be on the side of your characters, no matter what kind of heinous crime or thing they do. It is your job as a director to try to understand how and why, and to allow the viewer to come to their own conclusions. But when you lead people in a didactic way, it can be very flattening. And that has to then come from a very genuine sense of interest and curiosity, right? And so I think it's that background, that way of thinking. I also feel like I just am I would say one of my salient qualities is my curiosity. Like I am a kind of obsessively curious person.
Mm-hmm. When you're writing a character like Dunya gets to the point where she's incredibly abusive towards Flora, and I was just wondering if it was a little bit difficult to get into that headspace and like feel empathy for that character despite the cruelties she was committing.
You know, I think that if this kind of abuse were a one-off, that's one thing. But my research, over and over again, a pathology was revealed of this kind of violence that was happening between domestic workers and in their employees. And that made me just think, this is about larger systems that are being repeated. This isn't about just one person having this issue. And what are those conditions, right? And so I immediately felt for her. I immediately felt like something is going on in these homes between these women that is not right. And so that became just like, what is that? And so I actually have deep care and love for Dunya, even though she does a lot of really misguided, cruel things. I think she feels incredibly isolated, and she also is a young woman of great potential.
Yeah.
Right?
As a reader, that comes through. When I'm reading about Dunya in the beginning, before, her postpartum depression kicks in, and that's probably like the turning point when she does become a cruel person. But you see how disappointed she is in this situation, and how she went into this marriage thinking, it was going to be one thing, and then disappointment after disappointment. And now she's home with a baby and doesn't have the agency that she thought she did. And also, there's stuff going on in her head. Like I I wasn't, I didn't read her as a caricature, like she was a crazy, cruel person. I did have empathy for her. But then, like you said, she takes it to an extent that, women I knew who were disappointed in their marriages and maybe, after they had kids felt, a lack of freedom, that they didn't turn cruel like she did. And that's probably because of the system that she's within. And
I think so. I mean, I had 4 sensitivity readers for the book, and the Saudi reader, who I'm now quite close with, she wrote a letter to the publisher saying nothing in this book is exaggerated. If anything, things are much worse. Wow. So I think that's maybe for American readers, it can really feel like, wow, like how does this person become so cruel? But again, I don't think it's a one-off. I think it's really about these larger systems that are being played out in these intimate domestic spaces.
Yeah. So Justine is a museum curator who's invited from New York to go over and work on this museum. And one of the Emirates.
It's the Sheikh Zayed National Museum.
Sheikh Zayed, which is a real museum.
Yes, and she is hired to curate the Falcon exhibit.
Yeah, and to a Falcon exhibit. And she had experience doing an artistic impression of an opossum exhibit at the Natural History Museum in New York. That's where the book first meets her, right?
Right. So we open on Justine. It is the opening night of this wildly successful show that she's done on the American opossum, which was an early symbol of migration, which is actually true. And she has gathered all of these artists and musicians.
American migration?
Yes.
The opossum is a symbol of American migration, like Western pioneer expansion, kind of,
or of just like of people coming to this country. Like it was a real sense of the opossum was this symbol of that, and she has curated this exhibit around the opossum. Using the dioramas, but also inviting artists, visual artists, and musicians to really think about that. So she's kind of had this incredible interdisciplinary show, which doesn't usually happen at the Natural History Museum in New York. Yeah. And as a result of that show, she is asked and picked, would you be interested in doing this for the Falcon in the UAE?
And the Falcon is the symbol of the UAE.
Yes, it is the national symbol.
The national symbol of the UAE.
And it also has the Falcon has a very long history there in terms of relationships. Many kind of like Bedouins they were able to survive because of the Falcon, and now falconry is a huge sport. Yeah, and the relationship between humans and falcons is very deep, but it's very complex in terms of how the falcon is trained.
I like the way you describe, or the way you evoke the falcon as a bonded creature to humans versus the American symbol, the eagle, which is free and since the human connection gets brought up a lot in your book, I thought that was very evocative.
Yes, like I think that's one of those things. It's one of those knots for Justine, right? That she came in with a certain kind of set of expectations, but then when she actually starts exploring falconry and this relationship between the human and the falcon, that it's predicated on this deep sense of relationship, and also always there has to be the possibility that the falcon can be free, always. Which is very beautiful. It's confusing for her, though, because, again, the eagle is just independent. It's not a co-relationship.
Jen and I discussed briefly that there seems to be a motif of air conditioners in the novel. And did you just want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, look, I think one of the things that, to me, is if you spend time over there, of the heat, and you think about, or I was thinking about, the women that historically have survived and brought up families in this incredible heat, no air conditioning, these palm frond huts and just different ways that they had survived. And that now their air conditioning is the way that is done. I mean, even when you get off of the plane in Abu Dhabi, there are air conditioners outside on the curb. I mean, it just is astounding. So this relationship to the natural environment, but then how people are really kind of insulating themselves from the natural environment because it's quite oppressive. Even the desalination that's happening of the water. I mean, it's a miracle that there are these huge cities, societies, nations built in these harsh environments.
Yeah. And then I thought it was interesting how one of the ways Dunya subjects Flora to abuse is through like a lack of access to air conditioning and to this oppressive heat.
Yes. And it's interesting with Dunya, I feel like she has, of all the characters, in some ways, she has this relationship to the natural world, right? Whether it's to heat, but then she goes through that whole period where she's kind of obsessed with the cold and she's watching all those snow and blizzard videos. And I thought that was, I don't know. I had a lot of fun with her with all of that.
I wanted to ask you about Justine, though. She seems like the main point of view character who maybe represents you and you being transplanted into this environment to do something creative and interesting. But she doesn't hate everything about the place. You know, you're casting a lot of, obviously you're very humanistic the way that you look at all the characters in the book and how they respond. But the situation, I came away with a very negative view about what all this wealth is doing in this part of the world and how people's desire to get some of it for themselves was really not ultimately having a good impact on their lives. But you're making a face. Maybe you don't see it all as negative. But because my question was, Justine doesn't hate everything about the place. So what did you enjoy about living there? What did you like or admire about it?
Well, I think this sense of the transnational landscape. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, I remember going to the Dubai airport for the first time, and I felt like the world, like the global world, was raining down on me. Every single part of the world from that one airport you can go to. And I think, look, the call to prayer 5 times a day in the public space is beautiful.
Yeah.
You know, whether you're a faithful person or not, it is a beautiful thing to have that. Right. I mean, I found it beautiful, at least. I found the ability to travel to, Nepal, Myanmar, to expose our children to, Jordan, Oman, like all of these different places. I mean, I'm so grateful. So I think it's also really interesting to think about the relationship between the Gulf states and America, right? Pierpont Morgan, right, who created a lot of, museums, oil money. Gulf states, oil money, right? You think about the labor infractions and issues happening there in terms of, nation building. Look at our country, what we did, right? So there are a lot of correlations, as much as people may want to create this sense of other. And now you see Trump spending a lot of time over there. I think it's complicated. I think it's much more interesting if we allow ourselves to, instead of like what you were saying, like, oh, it's not good or it's bad. I guess I chafe a little bit at that because that's exactly the kind of thing that I was trying to, how can I get out of that way of thinking and into a different way of exploring and thinking about things?
Yeah. I felt it from the character's point of view.
Yes.
But I want to read more. I want to learn more about life in these places to more humanize the place, the systems.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a bit of a broad question, but why do you think a story like Gulf is important right now?
The experience of women, which is really under threat around the globe, is something that is of the utmost importance. And I really do believe that without equality for women, then you're not going to have a free society. I definitely believe that. I also really believe that work and labor is something that creates a sense of self-worth, and that there are a lot of labor issues for women around the world that need attention, and especially domestic and care work, which is very hard to create a sense of rules and a way of kind of how do you actually monitor, right, the safety of women in domestic and private spaces. This is a really complicated question. So this is something that needs to be thought about. You know, what does it mean for women to become part of a rebellion, right? When is it important to actually fight for things? I mean, we're facing this in our own country. You know, these are very real, alive questions, and they really do go from the smallest, most intimate place where we live in our domestic spaces to these very public spaces. And so I feel like the book really tries to take 5 different lenses to excavate and to inquire about those questions. And hopefully, I hope that people, after reading the book, feel more connected to women around the world, a little bit more informed around stories after they see in the headlines, but they don't know that much. And I would say most importantly that they've had a really great reading experience, that it's a novel and it's a piece of art. So yeah, I guess that's a long answer, but
it's a good.
It's all those things.
I mean, that's definitely the experience I had, and like Jen, I think I'm more interested in this part of the world. But yeah, thanks for writing the book. It was really good.
Wow, can I ask about the cover?
Yes,
it's
Keith
so
Hayes.
Beautiful. First of all, the color scheme, the shade of pink and blue together is just gorgeous. And what do you call this kind of image when you
It's
look
kind of like
at
a
it?
hologram.
It's kind of like a hologram. You look at it from one angle and it just looks like these scallop shells, and then you can twist it to any variety of angles and you see this woman's face coming out of it. Was this your idea, or was there an artist who came to you?
Keith Hayes, who is an amazing designer,
Yeah.
he created this incredible cover. I mean, I do think the book as an object, I think, is so beautiful. My
is.
friend Maura Condrick did the map. My friend Winky Lewis did the author photos. So, and, you know, it's interesting with this double image is that this image of the wave is actually one of the first images of the ocean that you find in Chinese maps, and then was used a lot in Japan. You see it on a lot of textiles. So I love that, right?
Yeah.
Just the historical nod to this symbol of water, and then the woman's face behind it.
Yeah.
And I just feel like that's kind of what the book is about, right? And also this dual, I think that's what a great designer does. Like you look at it one way and it seems one thing, and then you look at it another and it's something else. And I think he's a brilliant designer. I feel like, yeah, that's the book.
Yeah, yes, it's haunting. She's like staring at me right there. Are there 3 books you'd like to recommend to our listeners that connect to your writing of this book?
Yes. So the first is Svetlana Alexievich. Her work completely changed my life. She wrote Chernobyl, The Unwomanly Face of War, and Secondhand Time. So the way that she goes into communities and she does these interviews. She does interviews just with a microphone, and then the way that she cuts them together and her sense of the object as a way to tell stories is really incredible. So those books really helped me a lot in terms of just thinking about character, and also the importance of objects and telling stories. Another writer who was really important to me was Han Kang. She, wrote The Vegetarian, and this last book, which did not contribute to Gulf, but We Do Not Part, is a book that this has not happened for me in a long time. I finished that book and I opened up to page 1 again, and I would wake up in the middle of the night thinking about the structure. How did she structure this? It feels very much like a dream, but there's also all of this historical trauma. And the way that she creates this liminal space around history and the present and relationships, I think that book is brilliant. I mean, really brilliant. And then a book at the very beginning that really had a huge effect on me is this book by Jamaica Kincaid called Autobiography of My Mother. And the voice and the way that of the female voice and the sense of the ugliness, quote unquote, of the character, but who was also so fierce and amazing. I just kind of couldn't believe that it was possible. I just hadn't encountered that kind of voice and that kind of a visceral sense of the body and a woman's interior life that was so tactile that it just really blew open my mind in terms of what was possible.
Amazing. All right. So the book is Gulf, and it's published by Summit Books, an imprint of Simon & Schuster. And it's been out about
3 weeks.
3 weeks. And you're getting some positive reviews, and we're so happy to have you here to talk about it.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. It's such a pleasure.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
for the amazing questions.
You're
Thanks, Mo.
welcome. You taught him well.
Yeah.
If you'd like more information from us, check out the show notes or send us an email at podcast@villagewell.com. You can always order the books mentioned through our website. This episode of the Village Well podcast is brought to you by Village Well Books and Coffee. It was produced and edited by Josh Stretton Carlson, and our theme music is from Noah Vickland. See you next week, and keep reading.